This recording was produced by Oregon Trail Baptist Church. If you'd like to get more recordings or to leave your feedback, please visit us at www.otbchurch.com or write us at P.O. Box 298, Guernsey, Wyoming 82214. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope that today's recording will not just challenge your thinking, but will transform your life.
All right, Numbers chapter 28 this morning. Last week we covered chapters 26 and 27. And quite honestly, this is one of those sections of scriptures that for us it's a little tricky because these are details sometimes we don't live in this world, so not like we live in Neverland or anything. We don't live in the ancient Near Eastern world and mindset. And it'd be like if we went to China or India and we were thrown into another culture. Numbers chapter 28 through 29. I didn't put a heading on that. That's quite odd. Well, that I accidentally deleted it. I'm not going to read through these chapters. I know I put a heading there, and I must have deleted it. But this is all about offerings and sacrifices. So rather than read through everything, I've found some information, laid it out, and we're going to kind of start walking through this. There is a point I want to drive home before we're done here this morning. Bottom of page 1 here, the 4 kinds of offerings. These chapters 28 and 29, have a ton of specifics on different offerings. These 4 types of offerings are envisaged for these occasions, while whole offerings, the burnt flesh of animals, creel offerings, or grain and oil, and drink offerings, or they're often called libations, or wine, for purifications of one goat. So this whole section has 3 different types of offerings you're going to see. Now all that sounds like rambling. Turn to page 2, and I put these chapters. There's 4. Okay, yeah. What was the 4th? I'm sorry. Oh, the purification. So I found this chart here on page 2 and 3. This is from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. And to fit it into these 2 pages, I had to cut off 2 columns, which was the column for fellowship and the column for sin, which is that 4th offering you had mentioned. Okay, so sorry, I had to cut some information off to get it to fit here. But as you read through these chapters, they're going to overlap with Exodus 29. So every day, the daily offering you would make would have 1 male lamb in the morning and 1 in the evening. Okay, that would be considered. That's called the regular burnt offering. With that, you had about 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour, 1/4 of a hin of oil. The copy machine is now doing something. Okay, now I'm at the bottom here. An ephah is about 3 1/3 gallons. So think about 3 jugs of milk, a little bit more than that, and about 1/10 of that. So you're dealing with probably close to about 1/3, maybe a little more of a gallon. Okay, so that's kind of gives you some. Again, with some of these measurements, we're guessing a little bit. There's kind of a range of guess, but we haven't found an ephah measuring device yet that I know of. So, and then also you have the drink with it, 1/4 of a hin. A hin is about the equivalent of a gallon, pretty close to a gallon. So about 1/4 of a gallon of liquid with that. Now, how often was that done? Okay, what's that? Daily, but twice a day, right? Because you have 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening, okay? Now we have the weekly Sabbath. There's 2 male lambs plus the regular burnt offerings. Okay, and then you have the 2/10 ephah of fine flour plus the oil plus the daily offerings. Okay, so it's kind of adding up here. Monthly, or what is called the new moon. In the agricultural setting and before modern calendars and whatnot, they figured a lot of their months based off the moon. So you had 2 young bulls, and each of those with 1 ram. You had 7 male lambs, and then you had your regular offerings on top of that. Is this starting to sound like a lot? Okay. Then I'm not going to go through all the grain because I feel like at this point it's just spewing information, and you can look at this later as you want, and you have a footnote to find it in its original source. On Passover, the Passover, for each of the 7 days of Passover, you took 2 bulls each day, 1 ram, 7 male lambs each. On the second day after Passover, you took 1 male lamb and the regular burnt offerings. Then you had the Feast of Weeks, and I'm going to come back and talk about some of these different festivals a little bit. And you had 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs each, plus the regular offerings. Okay, Feast of Trumpets, very similar. So I hope I'm somewhat sparing you, not to spare you the Bible. This chart is putting into kind of visual form for us what these chapters are laying out. The Day of Atonement, you have 1 young bull, 1 ram, 7 male lambs each. And then for the atonement ritual, 1 ram for the high priest, 1 ram for the nation. And if you remember the whole scapegoat and that thing happening as well. Okay, so then you have the Feast of Tabernacles. Here's a math problem I should have had the kids do. They're working on tons of math right now. For the 8 days of Feast of Tabernacles, or Feast of Booths, it goes by both names. On the first day, you sacrifice 13 bulls, 2 rams, and 14 lambs. And that proceeds down. The numbers change until the 8th day, where it's 1, 1, and 7. How many total animals are sacrificed in the 8 days of the Feast of Tabernacles? It's like 250, somewhere in there. Okay. Now, why would this right here it's a calendar for Israel. Okay, they have these different festivals, they have these different celebrations, they have the daily process of these sacrifices. Why would God require so much? I mean, if you think about it, if you're dealing with within 8 days, yes, this is the whole nation, but this is a nation physically about the size of New Jersey. This is a massive amount of ongoing sacrifice. Why? Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. It keeps them busy. I'm not sure God doesn't do as much to keep us busy all the time, but it keeps them. It does give them that focus on the Lord. Okay, but in a certain aspect, I think I want to highlight to be close with God because of our sinful state. It's costly. Our sin costs something. And not all of these are sacrifices in a sense of atoning. A lot of these are offerings in the sense of trying to, even the feast, they're commemorative of what God has done and reminding the people. But this is kind of an ongoing... I think this is for the nation. I think. So you have, correct me if I'm wrong on that, there's probably some individual involvement for this, but I can't envision every family having the wherewithal to do all of this all the time. There's no way, because I mean, some people were coming in with 2 turtle doves as like Mother Mary and Joseph. So again, these are the point I'm trying to make is this was a costly system. Their devotion to the Lord took something. It was expensive. It cost them for that relationship. So, any other thoughts, questions here? I know it's kind of complicated. There's a lot of information that I didn't want to spend forever on it because it's like a spewing out of information. You can do this at home if you want. Go read through the chapter. I listened to the chapter and then looked at the chart and kind of followed along all the way through, and it does map it pretty nicely. Sometimes, if the Bible was written today, I'm sure there'd be some graphs and charts put into it, or tables. So, anyway, I'm not suggesting God did anything wrong. I'm just saying we like charts and tables. I don't think they did that back then. Page 4 here, Philip Budd notes in his commentary, he says, the overall theological emphasis focus on the costliness of worship though the whole offering and the acceptability of the community through the purification offering. The principles of dedication and acceptability remain fundamental to the activity of worship. But true worship can be offered the community as a whole, not merely individuals must be forgiven and restored, i.e. purification rendered acceptable. The community in turn must recognize that the worship and the cult, okay, so when we say cult here, what are we talking about? I should probably clarify that. Okay, because when we think of cults, what do you think of today? Okay, you think of bad things. You think of religious leaders forcing people to drink Kool-Aid and kill themselves type things, right? Okay. When you read that in a Bible commentary, a cult is any religious system that requires this is a very broad definition, it requires a blood sacrifice. So Israel's religious system was called a cult because they sacrificed animals. Does that make sense? You can't impose modern religious cults onto that meaning, but it's like one of those words like the term gay. If you said gay back in the 20s and 30s, it meant one thing, but if you say gay today, it means something totally different. And I was trying to think of another word. That's the only one that came to mind. So, anyway, what he's saying here is the worship and the cult, the whole system, they are no substitute for a costly commitment. They are in themselves a costly dedication of resources. So think about it. They have to be devoted and dedicated to God, willing to lay even economically everything, as it were, on the line for the Lord. Comments, questions there? All right, so here's where I'm going to repeat part of the chart, but just do it a different way. We had the daily offerings, the Sabbath offerings, the monthly offerings. Here's a calendar. I find this wheel helpful because you can see how the Jewish festivals overlap, how their months overlap with our year. Anyone know why they don't overlap perfectly? Has to do with numbers. We have 12 months in a year and they have 13. So if you try to put 12 and 13, it's not going to overlap perfectly. But you can kind of see there the different feasts at different seasons of the year. So when we're looking at April, there's the Feast of Passover. Then into May and June is Pentecost. Pentecost comes 50 days after Passover. Then you have the Feast of Trumpet, Day of Atonement, and Tabernacles are all tied in together with the Day of Atonement. They're all kind of closely related there. So let's talk a little bit about Passover. What was the Passover celebration for? What wouldn't work? Okay, yes. So that's why I put this chart on the back of your handout so you can flip all the way to the back and take a look at this. If it printed halfway decent. For some it did, for some it did not. Okay, so you have our calendars, starting with September, going through September because it's kind of halfway. At the top, under that you have the Hebrew lunar calendars, which has 13 months. How they split out, all right? Then they lay out roughly the different feasts and festivals. So you have the Trumpet, Day of Atonement, Tabernacles, all happening in Tishri or September, October. Then you have the dedication, and that's for us is in about December. I'm going to say that because I don't know. Yeah, I have to look at the other. This is an area of biblical study I am very weak in. I'm just going to say that. Purim. Does anybody remember what Purim celebrates? Esther, yes, the deliverance of the Jews in the story of Esther. That is the only holiday in here from a post-biblical, no, how to say this? Post-exilic perspective. Okay, so this is the only one that's happened after the monarchy. Then you have Passover, which is in the month of Nisan, which this is where it gets interesting. Passover was to be the beginning of the year, but Tishri 1 is also the beginning of the year. How does that work? Well, we do the same thing, do we not? It's fall. And when I worked for the post office, in the next month or two, they're going to have the end of their fiscal year. Exactly. We have a school year that starts in, August now, was September. We have a fiscal year that for some companies restarts in October. We have the actual year, which starts in January. And then if you're from other countries, you might have a Chinese New Year or whatever. You see how there's the same calendar, but you have different restarts to the year, as it were. Now look at their seasons here, how that ties in. So notice you have a rainy season and a dry season. And so as reading through scriptures, you've heard probably these terms of the early rains or the latter rains. You may not have heard of winter rains, but then the dry season. So then in the early rains is when you're plowing and you're planting, and then your harvest. And the harvest is split out with barley comes first, then wheat. And usually, now look, the feast of, I'm sorry, but usually the harvest kind of falls in that order. So you have several different produce or fruits coming at different times because of the nature of the season. So, right. So that's kind of why it lays out the way it does. A lot of their festivals are tied with seasons and with the ground. Not all of them. Passover, that was, what did it remind them of? Egypt, okay? Now, this is a point I'm going to make, but it's not a huge point. Is Passover and the unleavened bread, or are those the same festival? Okay, my wife is on to me. The answer is yes and no. Originally, they were distinct festivals. So the 7 days of unleavened bread led up to Passover, and it was its own festival. And then you had Passover as its own festival. Over time, those two merged and kind of have become one festival. Does that make sense? So our celebration of Christmas is actually a merger of two separate holidays. Does anybody know what the two holidays are? Andrew? Okay, well, what are the two holidays? American Christmas has mashed two separate holidays together. Anybody know what those are? Well, okay, kind of, no, not winter solstice, but St. Nicholas Day was originally December 15th, or December 10th. Then you had Advent, or you had, what we would call Christmas, the celebration of the birth of Christ. And so those two over time, because they're in the same month, merged together, which is why now St. Nicholas and Santa Claus is connected with Christmas. And so to us in our mind, all of that is one and the same holiday anymore, is it not? I mean, it's kind of, now you may not celebrate Santa Claus, and that's fine, I get that, and I understand that. We're going to focus on the birth of Christ. But those are one holiday mashed together. I think the same type of thing has happened with Passover and unleavened bread. Because it just kind of, as time goes on and thousands of years and they celebrate over and over, it kind of meshes into one holiday, especially when the 7 days of unleavened bread happen 7 days before Passover. I mean, it's just kind of gets all connected. Comments or questions there? Yeah. Isn't it amazing how God created the world to where there's different seasons at different times? Yeah. It's just boggled my mind. But anyway, Israel, is that below the equator or above it? Above? Okay. Yeah. Which they're pretty close to the equator, so their winter is probably not near as harsh as ours. So. Right. Right. Yeah. Under Passover here, the unleavened bread is the name of the original, a distinct seventh-day festival which began on the sunset of the 15th day of Nisan. Sunset, in a Hebrew mind, is when the day begins. You start with rest, and then you go to work. So in the evening is when their day begins. Scripture combines the Passover sacrifice with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In post-biblical times, the two festivals were fully integrated into a single holiday. What Passover for Christians has taken on a bit of a new significance. Any guesses as to what that would be? The crucifixion. And Christ, and even getting referred to as the Passover lamb. So here, these Passover lambs would shed their blood so that the death angel would pass over that door. Christ shed his blood so that, this is where, enjoy the picture, don't theologically pinhole it too much. God will pass over our sin. Now, what Christ did on the cross was more than allowing for God to pass over. He dealt with sin. He cleansed us from sin. But there's that picture there of him taking our place, whereas the lamb here took their place. And again, it reminds them of a deliverance of Egypt, but Passover always doesn't just remind them of the past, but it serves as a way to look forward. We've done a thing on how Jews celebrate Passover even today. One of the rituals they have today is they send a little boy to the door towards the end of their feast, and they open the door, and then I think they sing a song or whatever, but they're looking for and longing for Elijah to come as a prophet. They're longing for that, which we recognize John the Baptist came in the spirit and power of Elijah, and Christ has already come. They're looking and longing for Messiah. So even in Judaism today, Passover isn't just about the past deliverance, but it's looking forward to a future deliverance, one in which we as believers, we see is happening in Christ, which for us still kind of looks forward to the end of the world with Christ coming again in the second coming. So that is Passover. Comments or questions there? I don't want to... Yes. That will happen. Yes. Right. One of the things I find fascinating is this calendar, okay? These different feasts and these different festivals. It is one thing that has united the Jews throughout the centuries. What other people have been torn from their land for thousands of years and ever been able to come back and be a people? They didn't get fully integrated into cultures and societies. Right. Last year we had a couple Jews stay in our camper, and they both were from Russia, but have been able to return Jerusalem, to Israel, which is kind of neat because they weren't Orthodox Jews, as it were, but it was neat to talk to them, and they weren't even Jewish in their faith, but the fact that God would do that, I mean, I've met one person that would claim to be a Persian, but who claims to be Persian anymore? You know what I mean? Like these empires, who today would claim to be Assyrian? I mean, they're yeah, okay. But you know what I'm saying? Like, so many of these empires have come and gone, and they're wiped off the face of the earth, and they're gone. But the Jews can be scattered all across the world, and that yet when God starts to bring them back home, they have a land, they have a culture, and even if you're familiar with some of the Holocaust stories and different things, even in the middle of all of that, they would try to celebrate these festivals. It brought them a remembrance of who their God was, what he had done, but it also brought them hope, looking to the future of, okay, we're exiled right now. We're away from home, as it were, right now. But we have hope of one day returning. Yeah, why not? This is actually a biblical theme. The theme of exile. And does anybody know where that theme of exile starts in Scripture? And I'll give you a hint. It does not start with Israel. Adam and Eve. Yep. There's this sense of exile where they were banished from the garden because of sin and breaking that fellowship. But in the same chapter they're sent out of the garden, there's hope of the seed of the woman crushing the serpent. And so there's this kind of this longing and this to come back out of exile and to come home. We see some of this played out in Daniel and the prophets. They live this tension because are they living in the promised land? No, they're living in Babylon. Jeremiah, was he was taken to Babylon, but Daniel specifically was living in Babylon, living in exile. Daniel worked for the king of Babylon. But at the same time he worked for the king of Babylon, who was he truly loyal to? God. So although he's living in exile, he's living in a world that is not his, as it were. He's looking for and longing for the day to return, but Jeremiah describes, he says, plant vineyards, raise crops, raise your family, build your houses. There's a way to live in exile that is honoring to God. When we see the story of Daniel, what we see is they submit to the Lord and his leadership, and they submit to the king. But when those two don't agree, what do? When the king says, bow down to this statue, what does he have for him to do? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they don't. They choose to stay loyal to the Lord. So that you just got 30 seconds of a theme that could be developed for hours. But anyway, that's probably why it didn't come out so well. Moving on from Passover, we have the Feast of Weeks. All right, this feast is also called the Day of First Fruits, or the Feast of Harvest. It's being celebrated 50 days after the raising of the sheaf of the first fruits at the end of Passover and unleavened bread. It was given the name Pentecost. That's in intertestamental period, and used in the New Testament, that term Pentecost in Acts 2 and Acts 20 and 1 Corinthians. So this Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, it's 50 days after Passover, and it's kind of celebrating the first fruits of the harvest, reminding them that God gave them this fruit, this harvest. Then we have the Feast of Trumpets. There's no actual reference to this feast as the Feast of Trumpets in the Old Testament. However, it's been frequently applied to the first moon or the Tishri 1. So it's like their beginning of the new year. The trumpets are probably either... I should use my notes more and try not to use my head because I keep forgetting. Some think it's a New Year celebration. Others think it marks These trumpets are a heralding proclamation about the Day of Atonement that's coming in just a few days. So it's a looking forward ceremony to the Day of Atonement. On the side here, I put a little thing. These 3 different feasts occur all together in the month of Tishri. The Feast of Trumpets is a call for repentance. The Day of Atonement sought for redemption. And then the Feast of Tabernacles is a pilgrimage feast to remember the fulfillment of the redemption from Egypt. And that's those 3. You see how they kind of go together all within the same month. So the Day of Atonement, this was the big, I don't want to say ceremony, but this was the big festival and the big day highlighted within the book of Leviticus. In fact, all of Leviticus is a big chiastic structure pointing to this ceremony. They would have a day of fasting and self-denial, and they would rest on the 10th day of the 7th month, which is Tishri. The sanctuary would be cleansed of impurities, and the Israelites' sin are sent away on the scapegoat. You remember how there would be 2 goats, and one would get sacrificed. The priest would lay his hand on the other goat, and that goat was sent out of the camp. And the picture was that the goat that's getting sent out of the camp is being sent out with all the sin of Israel on it. So it's like sending all your garbage out. And in later Jewish tradition, not in the Bible, but later Jewish tradition, they started to push that goat off a cliff to kill it to make sure it never came back in the camp. Just to make sure it didn't come back. It was the most holy feast of the year. And this was the time of year when the high priest this was once a year, he would enter into the Holy of Holies and make atonement for the nation's sin. The last feast we had is the Feast of Booths, and this is a feast, it's called booths or tents or tabernacles because they would build these little tents. So they would essentially go camping for a week. They would build these little tents and structures and live outside of their home, but by doing that, it was reminding them of what? Yes, the wilderness and the wanderings. So they would do all this to remember what God did in their time in the desert, which we've been going through this story quite extensively. If every year you built a little camping site with this in mind, of remembering what happened in the wilderness, you would think that you wouldn't forget. Do they? Yeah. So these celebrations, do you see how they tie very closely into Israel's story? Do you see how they tie everything together? Yes, it costs them something, but the reason they do these celebrations, the reason for these different things, as the agricultural season goes around, some of them remind them of God's graciousness and His provision because they're at harvest. Some of them remind them of, okay, this is the beginning of whatever year, whether it's our school year or our whatever. This is the beginning of to remember this many years we've been set free from Egypt. Then you have, like here with the Day of Atonement, of what God has done for them and what God's providing for and through them, in that the Messiah would come, who would take away, he would be the one to deal with the sin of the world. And then you have the Feast of Booths, reminding them of the wilderness wanderings. Now, do we do things in our culture that help us remind us of our history? Okay, 4th of July. Why is that an important day to us as Americans? Elizabeth? I wouldn't say set free, but that's the day it started, right? Like we declared our independence. We weren't just given our independence. We weren't set free. We fought for it. Okay, it's memorable because that is the moment as a nation when we said, no, we are an independent nation. We're going to, and we remember that. We remember that quite bombastically. What's some other holidays that we have that we celebrate and remember certain key elements? John? Okay, that wouldn't be an American. That's more of a world holiday. Okay, but it is a holiday we celebrate. How about Okay, Elizabeth? Okay, Thanksgiving. Okay. What do we try to remember on Thanksgiving? Right. We also thank the Lord for what he's done to establish us as a nation. And the history of Thanksgiving goes all the way back to the Puritans, even though they didn't actually, it wasn't a national holiday till much later. It reminds us to be thankful. However, in our own lifetimes, have we seen some of these holidays change? Memorial Day, Thanksgiving, Labor Day. Have we seen some of the significance of them fade? Okay, and that could be. I don't remember. I do remember they were thankful for the Indians, but I don't know that they weren't thankful to the Lord. Oh.
That's mostly something that people
Oh. They've tried to split it out from the Lord.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find ironic is usually Thanksgiving Day is spent scouring the papers to see what you're going to buy on Friday. Does the irony not hit you? I mean, instead of being thankful for what you have, you're scouring the papers and planning your route, you know. And I know that that's not, most people at Guernsey are not doing that. But if you live in a big city, or you live in that area, you know, where that's happening, that's the reality. It's like you're looking for a great deal to buy something. So my whole point is, like, it seems like there over time holidays, even these feasts and celebrations, they become sometimes so normal to us they lose some of their significance, which is what I think happens in Israel. When they get into the land, like we're going through the book of Judges, you don't really read of them celebrating this. In fact, the most you start to hear of them celebrating this is with Ezra and Nehemiah in the exile. You read of them trying to do this stuff again. So you do have it in the New Testament. Christ went through some of this stuff, so at least in that time they're trying to bring some of these things back. But we as a people need to remember, we need to be rooted in our text. God gave Israel holidays and festivals to remember who he is and what he's done. And they're tangible ways that you remember. This is why we tangibly actually go to a church on Sunday and things of that nature. There's tangible things we do, not trying to conjure anything up, but trying to remember what God has done for us and to keep that at the forefront. So, I'm sorry, it's not the most... I didn't read a single verse. I taught an entire lesson and never read a verse. Feel free to read the 2 chapters yourself. We're trying to cover details, I guess, more than anything. So, comments or questions? All right, well, we will pick this up when I am back, which won't be for a while. By then, we'll figure out how we're going to finish out the book of Numbers and what we're going to tackle next in Sunday school. So, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for the day you've given us. We thank you for the feast and tabernacle, the celebrations you gave to Israel. And Lord, may they serve as a reminder to us that you have done great things for us as well. Our story as Christians is very much tied to the Jewish scriptures, the Jewish story, and how you brought them up as a nation. And yes, although as a church we are distinct, we are not the same as the nation of Israel, we are thankful that you're a God who your character doesn't change. And as you walk and mold us through this walk of life that we have, you give us specific ways in which we can remember who you are and what you've done. I ask that as we ourselves, as we celebrate various holidays, as we worship together on Sundays, as we read your word, would these things that we do not be just functions or things we do, but would they be things that we actively draw closer to you and remind ourselves of your character and live in light of that. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.